Thank you all for being here.
Well, we are in for quite a treat tonight. I could not be more excited to sit on this stage with these three luminaries. And in a second, I'll introduce them and we'll get going on what I know will be a very spirited conversation. But before we do that, I want to pause and ask you all to give some love to the student leaders of the UNC Institute of Politics. Each of these governors on this stage know that at some point in life, I have twisted their arms to ask them to do something or the other. And they know how hard it is to get one of them on any given night. To get three of them, these students rock. So thank you to the students, and thank you for not just the logistical gymnastics of making this evening happen, but thank you for the vision behind it. At a time when our nation, our state, seems to have an insatiable thirst for conversation, real, meaningful conversation across differences, here we are in Chapel Hill, and we're going to get into it. So let me first just say a couple of things about these gentlemen sitting on the stage. Directly beside me, Governor Jim Hunt, the 69th and 71st governor of North Carolina, the longest serving governor in our state's history.
Thank you.
Seated beside him is Governor James Martin, who served as governor from 1985 to 1993. Just a little bit of trivia because we are on a university campus. He is the first PhD to hold the office. And finally, but certainly not least, Governor Pat McCrory, who served as the 53rd mayor of the city of Charlotte and the only mayor of the city of Charlotte, although others have tried to make it to the governor's office. Welcome, Governor McCrory. So I'll start with you, Governor McCrory. I want to know, when was the moment you first knew you would run for governor? Who'd you tell, and what was their reaction? You?
Well, actually, my decision to run for governor started when I was a city council member and I decided to run for mayor instead of Congress. And it was my dad, who was in Florida at the time, actually sadly telling his mom, his 100-year-old mom, that he had cancer. And all of a sudden, a congressional seat came up due to Alec McMillan resigning, Governor Martin's old congressional seat, in fact. And I'd always wanted to go to Congress because I was an intern working for Richardson Pryor out of Greensboro, so my goal was to be in Congress one day. And so that seat came up, and I said, I'm going to run. I was just elected mayor pro tem, and I called my dad up, and I was 38 years old, and I said, Dad, I'm going to run for Congress. And he said, why? And I said, Dad, it's Congress. He said, why? I said, Dad, it's Congress. And I'm speaking to the young kids here, and he said, so where can you make more of a difference? You have a chance where you can become mayor of Charlotte because Richard Van Root's not going to run for re-election. And I said, Dad, it's Congress. And then he started talking about what would get old in Congress and what you could accomplish in the executive branch. And in 24 hours, I changed my mind. I took my dad's wisdom, and the reason you should run for something is where can you make a difference?
Absolutely.
And I made a decision at that point in time, instead of running for Congress in 1994, I ran for mayor in 1995 for that executive branch. And so it was my dad I first told that you're kind of right. The executive branch is where you can make things work.
So how many times have you said thank you to your dad?
What's that?
How many times have you said thank you?
Well, my dad, thankfully, I got elected in November of 95, and my dad passed away 1 week later.
Wow.
But he hugged me on election night, got out of his wheelchair. He had cancer, sadly, and he was still very young. And quick funny story, this was pre-Clinton and all the controversy there. I got up to hug him, and he hugged me on election night in Charlotte, and he said, "I got one piece of advice for you, Pat." And I said, What's that, Dad? This is it. How many times you get to talk to your dad and get advice, and you're the new mayor of a big city? And he whispered in my ear, he said, "Keep your damn zipper up." And I've taken that in much more than the context in which it's said. In other words,
your question.
I've kind of taken that as do the right thing.
I like your dad.
And so, I'll make a short story short. I made the same decision when I was mayor of Charlotte. Then I had a chance to possibly run for a statewide Senate office. But I said, I think as governor, I could use those same skills. And I'd worked with Governor Hunt as mayor, especially in transportation. I worked with Governor Hunt in implementing mass transit in Charlotte. I don't know if you remember, I worked very closely with your DOT department, and I went, this is where the action is. And this is where you can make a difference. So if I was going to go anywhere after serving 14 years as mayor, after working with Governor Hunt and Governor Easley, I said that would be a great experience, and it was.
Thank you. Governor Martin, you had a different path. When did you first know you were going to run for governor? Who'd you tell, and how did they react?
Well, I was in Congress and was looking for a way to get home. I'd been in the minority for 12 years, which was long enough. I guess at the time I was thinking about it was 11 years. And the word got out to one of my good friends who was a cousin of Governor Hunt, Rusty Good from Charlotte. And Rusty came to see me. He brought a legal pad where he had written out on one side the reasons why I should run and for governor reasons why I should not. There were only about two things on the first side. He told me I should not run for governor. I should stay in the seat that I had in Congress. And I thanked him for his advice and didn't heed it. I had a bad habit of taking people's advice and going another way. I'm glad I read it. It's the best job in politics. Any of y'all want to get into politics, I mean, you don't have to fight wars, but you do have competition. You have important challenges that are ahead of you. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes there are things that you can do on your own as governor. Sometimes you've got to get the General Assembly to go with you. And sometimes that's easier than at other times. Is that a soft way to put it? Sometimes that's pretty hard because they've got their own ideas. But I'm glad we did it. And most importantly, because for me, I had to get acquainted with the people of the whole state, from the mountains to the coast. And it's just such a beautiful state and beautiful people with different ideas. I mean, they're different. The cultures are different, and
Absolutely.
yet they blend together so beautifully. And I know I made for me and for Dottie, the right decision.
Governor Hunt, when did you know you would run for the best job in politics? Who'd you tell, and how did they react?
Well, I got into politics because I knew it was a way to help people. My family had been involved. I grew up on a farm in eastern North Carolina, a dairy farm. I grew up milking cows by hand before we had electric milkers. I was in the 4-H club and the FFA, and I learned parliamentary procedure and something about public speaking. But my family was always involved through the Grange and other groups in trying to improve things, especially the public schools. And I knew that our schools weren't good enough. My mother was a teacher. She'd been a librarian. My daddy was a soil conservationist. And they were concerned, and they cared about people. And early on, I learned about treating people fairly and equally. But I watched them get involved. The first candidate they ever got involved for was a man named Carr Scott. Don't know if you ever heard of him. Go back at some of your recent magazines and read about his calf walk down in eastern North Carolina, where if everybody walked 20 miles, they'd get a calf. I was at that calf walk with my daddy. But Carr Scott was a man we'd worked for, and after he won, he paved our dirt road. How many of you in here have ever lived on a dirt road? Well, when I started out, everybody's hand went up. At political rallies, I used to say, years ago, 50 years ago, if you want your road paved, come sit at the front of the room. Because you wanted people to come to the front of the room. And they came. In any event, I was there when they paved my road. I was 13 years old. I learned right then, you do something in politics, you can do something to help yourself and your neighbors. And then after I was student body president at NC State, a fellow came along and said he was going to run for governor. And he wanted to run on a platform of improving teaching in North Carolina, to have more good teachers, to raise their salaries. And he asked me to go around the state and organize young students or students for Terry Sanford for governor. And I did it. I organized every college in North Carolina. Didn't have many community colleges then, but every one of them. And those young people worked hard to elect Terry, and he was a great education governor. I saw all of that, and I knew that you could get things done. You could make life better for people. And that's sort of the moral dimension of this, folks. If you want to help people, and God wants us to help people, politics is a good way to do it. Now, there are some things in politics that aren't nice. We've all had our experiences with it. But politics, and I'm so proud of these young students, this Institute for Politics here at Carolina. Terry Sanford was a Carolina man. He encouraged folks here to be involved in politics, as had Frank Graham. And so I got involved, and because of all of that, I decided to run for something. I looked at the field, and that particular year, the thing that might make sense was to run for lieutenant governor. The job was open, and I ran. And I had the help of a lot of good people, especially the old Sanford organization, all over the state, who'd elected him. And they were progressive folks, and that's why I ran for governor, and that's why we won 4 times.
Thank you for that look back. I now want to ask you each to look ahead for me just for a moment. This state has been fortunate to have visionary governors. Governor Hunt, you just mentioned 2 of them, Carr Scott, Terry Sanford. These governors have well positioned this state to live up to the ideal of our state motto, to be and not to seem. I want to ask you 3 to look ahead for us to 2030 and then share what you hope for North Carolina in the next decade, and how do you think we need to position ourselves today for that path forward? And I'll start with you, Governor Martin.
You said for 23?
2030.
2030, okay, for the decade.
Yep.
Well, for state government, obviously the most important responsibilities are, first of all, education. Public schools, university system, community colleges, and the private colleges too, because in a more limited way we support them. That's our number 1 priority, and it ought to always be the number 1 priority. I was pleased to be able to truthfully claim that during my 8 years, we increased the percentage of the state budget, the percentage of the general fund that went to education 6 of those years and over the entire 8 years. and I was very proud of that. Another major responsibility, of course, is to provide for a transportation system that can get people to work, can get their products to the market. And I was pleased that although in my first campaign I only promised to build the highway down the interstate down to Wilmington.
And you delivered, let me just say.
That was the only promise I made. Of course, my handlers told me I was crazy, that my opponent was promising every highway, and I said, well, they got just as good a chance to get it from me as they did from him. But from me, they'd get unpromised paving rather than unpaved promises, and I thought that was a pretty good slogan. It worked for me. So, you know, sometimes I could get cute like that. But the other thing is we had to have more competitive jobs. We had to have a job market that could employ our people so that we could afford all those things. And so because of that, I settled on this kind of a mantra, you might say: better schools, better roads, and better jobs. And that worked pretty good. There are a lot of other issues, and every once in a while I'd throw in a fourth one, you know, for public safety, health, environment, whatever it might be. But those were the three that I focused on. And I still think that those are the most important responsibilities, and to help with all the other dozens of things, I think we have to come and focus on those once again. I'm a little bit worried that we can't, it's very difficult to recruit businesses into the rural areas, and we tried that. And I personally think you have to first recognize that the most important farming areas probably are not going to support a major manufacturing industry, but the small cities nearby can. And that's why, as you know, I supported that global transpark. Now, it's not lived up to everything we thought it would be. It was an idea generated by Jack Casarda of the Keenan Institute.
They just announced a new one there, new
Yep,
company.
sure did, yeah. But it's moving, and it's going to be a big thing for the central part of the eastern state, just as the Wilmington Port has generated a lot of business there. And the Greenville, East Carolina University has generated a lot of economic benefit there. But in particular, in the eastern areas, such as the three I mentioned, and in the mountains, that's where we've got to focus on providing jobs so that those people can do it. And I give credit to those who got the fiber optic system into the mountains. That's going to be a big benefit for them to be able to compete. But that's the key for that decade, is to have the economic strength all across the state that we can support the things that we need in order to help people that, as Governor Hunt was rightly talking about.
Governor Hunt, 2030, what do you see?
Well, Governor Martin is right, and I commend him for his leadership on all those things. But I want to say this, and this is going to be a little different from what you're maybe hear from everybody. The key to the future, the main key to the future, is developing our people, developing their minds, their skills. And we have to help people be in a position so they can do that. Governor Jim Holshouser is gone, but when I ran for lieutenant governor, this state was electing the first Republican governor in 100 years. His name was Jim Holshouser, and he was a good governor. I was lieutenant governor. The lieutenant governor in those days, president of the Senate, had a lot of power, appointed committees and so on. And one of the things I did was help protect his power as governor, because a lot of the Democrats wanted to take it away from him. That was wrong. In any event, he did a lot of things. He and I both had run on a platform to put kindergartens into our public schools. Tonight, frequently, I ask young people, did you go to public kindergarten in North Carolina? And they all say, yes. I say, do you know you didn't used to have it? And they say, you didn't? How many of you remember when we didn't have public kindergartens, and there are
Go
not
back
many
there, too.
hands. Because when Governor Holshouser and I ran in 1976, it was in his platform, and it was in my platform for lieutenant governor. And when we got in there, we put it in place. And the Chamber of Commerce in Charlotte sent a lobbyist down to work every day to try to pass it. Business saw the need for it. In any event, we put the kindergartens in. We've worked hard to improve education. There's a lot left to do. We've got a lot of poor schools and poor people. So for the next 10 years, I think what we ought to be doing is working on improving the lives of our people and the opportunities for our folks to become good, effective, useful workers and to have what it takes to have a good life for themselves and their family. How do you do that? One, we ought to improve education a lot. We ought to improve the early years a lot. How many of you all have been around and seen what it's like in these schools with the kids who come into kindergarten? My wife Carolyn's on the front row here. Every Monday she goes to a public school that is poor as it can be. And she came home the first day and said, honey, you won't believe it. First of all, it was segregated primarily. We've gone back to segregated schools, and that's wrong. That's not easy to deal with in today's world. I know that. But we ought to be as diverse as we can be. But then we ought to help every child in those schools, whatever they are, become what they can be, what God wants them to be. We can do that. But you don't do it, you start it with it before birth. Before they go to school. From birth on. I guess the thing I'm proudest of about education, in addition to getting teacher pay up to the national average, one time, was putting in Smart Start to help those children in those earliest years get a good start. Go to good child care. Have the families have good help. Help make sure they get good health care. Now, if we'll commit ourselves to all of our people, especially our children, in the next 10 years, then 10 years from now, you think about this, every child born in the next, those who are born during the next 10 years will be in what, the 5th, 6th grade, something like that. And they will have had a good start. They're reading, they're learning. They can do all these things. And they're alert. They're going to make those good employees later on. People will want to hire them, and they want to pay good wages to them. So I think that's one of the big things we ought to do. Let's really provide excellent early childhood education for every child. And of course, I also believe we ought to provide good medical care for people. Folks, I want to tell you, it's tough if you don't have good medical care. Suppose you didn't have good insurance. Look at what they send you out every month or every quarter. And look at how little you pay, but what good coverage you get. Everybody needs to have good health insurance. If we'll work on that and invest in our people over the next 10 years, we can be a great state. Before I knock the water over, I feel strongly about it. In the next 10 years, we can make North Carolina, I think, the best state in America. Of course, we think it is already in some ways, but we need to get about this thing. We can do this if we work at it.
Governor McCrory. "2030, what do you see?"
First
How
of
do
all,
we
I'm
get
supposed
there?
to follow that.
I can knock your water over.
That was Jim. I'll mention.
It is water.
I'll mention 2 things, and we could all mention 5. But North Carolina is the place to be, And people are moving to North Carolina from all over the world, not just all over the country. And our infrastructure is not prepared for the future growth. All you have to do is go down Highway 40 right now. You can widen Highway 40 for another 5 lanes and it won't make any difference. And so as mayor of Charlotte, I put together a 25-year transportation plan, which included mass transit. When I became governor of North Carolina, we instituted the same thing, was to institute a 25-year transportation plan, building upon what these two gentlemen did. And one of the first things we did was say, okay, I'm going to take the politics out of where we build our roads in North Carolina. We're going to do it based upon formulas where the road demand is, where the people are, and where we need to connect rural areas that need more jobs. And I really took the power. The legislature didn't even know it when we wrote the bill. In fact, it could never pass today. We took the power out of the legislature and gave it basically to a formula where instead of, in the past, frankly, in North Carolina, when I was mayor, I'd go throughout North Carolina and you'd go down a 2-lane road, then all of a sudden go to 4-lane road, then it'd go back to 2-lane road, then it'd go back to 4-lane road, and wherever it was 4-lane, it was named after a state senator somewhere. And that, to me, wasn't good planning. And so I'm very proud that we took that out of the system. And it really irritated some DOT members and some legislators that like to control that power because you get votes where you put the roads. But if the roads don't have any clear plan to connect North Carolina, connect the rural towns to the metropolitan areas where the jobs are, we're going to be in trouble. And I think that's what we need to do and continue the implementation of that and make sure we don't return back to the days of the political system running our transportation system because we can't afford it. And the other thing we have to do, knowing Highway 40 can not only widen so far, or Highway 85 or Highway 77 where I live, we've got to look at mass transit some more. I'm very proud of what we did in mass transit in Charlotte. Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill have made a major mistake in not forming a coalition to make it happen in this area. And shame on them. And I blame both Republicans and Democrats for that. I was hoping to get that restarted during my 4 years as governor. But sooner or later, this area has got to get a mass transit program going. And then we also need a program to connect Raleigh and Charlotte and Greensboro to Atlanta, to Birmingham, to Richmond, because this I-85 corridor and 40 corridor is going to be one city 50 years from now. And the highway system will not be able to control it. So we need alternatives to that, and we need a vision and a strategy to implement that plan. And part of my vision as governor was to first take the politics out of where we put the roads so we can begin and start that vision. I had a great Secretary of Transportation, Tony Tata, a good military guy, and he started that process. And then we need to find the funding source to pay for it, and at both the national level and at the state level, and get that situated. So if we don't grow our infrastructure with the growth, we're going to choke, and we're going to become just like the Northeast cities where everyone's coming to us. We're going to become them unless we start planning for that, and we're about to run out of time if we don't do it now. And one other issue that we haven't brought up that was my most difficult part of being governor, and that's the healthcare system, especially mental health and addiction. We better in the next few years deal with mental health and addiction, because if you look at our jail system, about 80% of our prisoners have mental health and addiction issues. And when we release them, they're going to have those exact same problems. And in Charlotte, by the way, we're releasing a lot of people, and we're up to 107 murders last year. We're back to early 90 levels. And we've got to deal with this mental health crisis in our country, an addiction issue with alcohol, drugs, both legal and illegal, and quit glamorizing this stuff. And because if we don't do that, we're not going to have the labor force that we need in the future. And it's tearing up families, it's tearing up communities, it's tearing up our education system. And a lot of people are losing their life right now, and it's not being talked about in the obituaries that you read. And it's costing us a heck of a lot of money. I mean, that was the biggest growing cost of my state budget was mental health. And we have so few beds and so few cares. And to me, the state should lead in that effort and be the role model of other states in the nation, because it's a national crisis, both in rural and urban areas.
Anita, go ahead, Governor.
Yeah, I was going to add a footnote on transportation if my colleagues don't object, and they
Go
won't.
for it.
Because I see Governor Hunt's ready with another comment too. We have to have a new way to pay for building transportation system.
That's right.
Back in the end of my first term, some saw it as a political gambit, and it was. It worked for me. I proposed to build a network of interstate quality highways all across the state, and we call it the Highway Trust Fund. And it was immediately brought up and torpedoed in the Senate for obvious reasons. But after election, everybody then was for it. The problem is it was going to build 4 lanes, divided highways with interchanges, and it would work according to the finances of the time that we passed it. The problem was we didn't count on all you people driving these efficient automobiles, and there's not enough money coming in from the gasoline tax, which we raised, by the way. Can you imagine a Republican governor proposing a tax increase? But my philosophy was you lower taxes when you can, but you raise taxes when you have to, and when you're going to get something different for it. Not just the same thing at a higher cost, but you get something new and important for the transportation system. But you can't pay for that with cars that get 25, 30, 50 miles to the gallon, because there's not enough revenue. And therefore, there's going to have to be a lot of thought, and the next decade this decade will be a good time to work that out.
How about toll lanes? You can win an election that way.
Well, that toll lane was a good idea. I'll tell you right now, it's working. UNBev Purdue got blamed for it, but here's one South Iredell guy that said all along that was a good thing, because people that have to get into Charlotte can move into the toll lane, pay the extra expense, and it relieves the pressure on the regular lanes. Now, if you have a wreck that straddles both sides, it's the same as before. You can't get there. You have to go over to 115 and 21. But your bill will give us extra money for 115 and 21. So it's a good deal.
Serious insights here, people.
Hunt, you're next.
Well, I just want to add a word here.
He was my predecessor and my successor. Which
He learned from me, I learned from him.
So if you think of the sandwich analogy, I was the bologna between his two. Or the beef, depending on which party you're a member of.
By the way, you can work together on a lot of things. You know, we've done a lot of it. On transportation, we have to pay for it. By the way, Carolyn and I went to a big transportation conference last week, and we learned about these new kinds of cars, and they're not just self-driving cars. They're cars that will be built to be a lot safer, so that if somebody swerves in your path, that car will recognize it and swerve and avoid it, whether or not you do it as a driver. That's something we should all learn. We should be interested in these kinds of technologies and the kinds of transportation changes we need to make for the safety of our own families as well as for the economic reasons. Now, I recall as they're talking about the things they pushed on, I recall my last campaign for governor in 1996. We needed to improve rail transportation from Charlotte to Raleigh and Raleigh back to Charlotte. I had a study made, and there were co-chairs. One was the president of Wake Forest University, and the other one a leading business CEO in North Carolina. And they came out with recommendations about what we needed to do. And if we did those things, we could reduce the time for a train to travel from Raleigh to Charlotte by 1 hour. You could really make it work. And we've just about done that now.
You got to get rid of the grade crossing.
That's right. I bet most of you didn't know that. We've already made that kind of progress. We can and should make a lot more. Charlotte's done a great job putting in light rail. This triangle area should do the same thing. It was a great mistake for us not to have that light rail in the Research Triangle. And I want us to get back to it. And it takes money, and we should invest it in it. But we can do that. So, you know, we're talking about the future. We worked with these young people here tonight. We had dinner with them beforehand. What we have to think about is what we can do and what we can be, and then figure out how to do it and work together on it. North Carolina can do that. And I want these young people to get involved in politics. My wife Carol and I sat at a table and talked to them about what they were going to do, and I challenged all of them to get involved in the campaign. Didn't say what kind of campaign or who, but get out there and get involved and do something. And I'm so proud of this Institute for Politics. If there's ever a place that ought to be getting their young people interested and involved, it's UNC-Chapel Hill. But I think all the other schools should do it too. And you all need to support this institute, and thank you for being here tonight.
Speaking of politics, there is no politics like the politics between the executive and legislative branches of government. Governor McCrory, what was your strategy for dealing with the North Carolina General Assembly?
What was what?
Your strategy for dealing with the North Carolina General Assembly. And we do have to go home tonight, right?
We were talking about this backstage. I'll tell you, one of my strategies was I called on Governor Hunt and Governor Jim Martin, because most people don't know this. It was on the bottom of the headlines, but I sued my own Republican legislature because it was a power struggle. Just like Jim Hunt had a power struggle with his Democratic legislature when he was governor. I think, Jim, you may have had some similar problems.
With the Democratic legislature.
With the Democratic legislature, yeah. Mine was with my
That's all I had.
Mine was with my own party, where in North Carolina we've got a legislature that's extremely strong, and they wanted to become even stronger when I was governor by getting involved in the day-to-day operations of the departments that the governor is responsible for. And they were just going to do it the hell with it. And I had to take them to the state Supreme Court, and who joined me were these two governors. I called them both up, and I think we brought a team together, and thankfully for all future governors, we won that case to at least retain the existing authority of the executive branch, which is responsible for the operations of state government, the day-to-day operations of state government, which is extremely important. You cannot have a legislature, whether it be in D.C. or here in Raleigh, be responsible for the day-to-day operations. The legislature makes the laws. The governor enforces the law and operates. And if we keep losing that, I think we're going to have more corruption, we're going to have inefficiency, and we're not going to have a sound strategy for the next 10 to 50 years. And so one of my strategies was, frankly, to fall on the sword, which did hurt my relationship with my Republican leaders. Behind the scenes, they actually fought against me, which maybe had an impact on my reelection. But I'm proud of these two gentlemen who went to the Supreme Court hearing with the legislature on the other side of the aisle. And we all signed the petition together to protect, regardless of party, the executive branch's responsibility. And so that was one of my strategies. But, you know, most disputes, you're seeing it in D.C., and, you know, most disputes are not partisan disputes in Raleigh or Washington. It's usually disputes about power. Just like in the private sector, I come from the private sector, usually large organizations, it's turf about power and ego and pride. And that's one of the great challenges of being a mayor, a governor, or president that you're seeing at all levels of government. But y'all give both these gentlemen a round of applause for coming to my help. You didn't read about it, but it was probably one of the, it was McCrory versus Berger and Tillis was the case.
Right after I talked with Pat about that, after he called me, I get a call from Governor Hunt over here, and he says, we got to do this. I said, well, okay, I'm already in, let's do it. Of course, for him, it was maybe a little easier to rub the noses of the Republican General Assembly a little bit.
It was.
But it was the same when it was all, we all realized that.
We had to protect you, Pat, from the Republicans.
Right. Right. But what we had working for us was the North Carolina Constitution says that the executive, judicial, and legislative powers shall forever be separate and distinct. Now, some people believe that a constitution means what you want it to mean from year to year. I happen to believe it means what it said. And that's what it said, and the Supreme Court of North Carolina agreed with the McCrory suit, and we're very proud to do it.
And just a year ago, Jim, you might want to, we again gained, me and you and Beverly Perdue and Mike Easley, the five of us, joined forces for a second time.
Against the constitutional amendments.
That's right.
Yeah, the idea there was if they put in the Constitution that the legislature could appoint the executive branch officers, then it's no longer against the Constitution, is it? So I wanted to be sure that all five of us were in on that, and wish Governor Easley and Perdue could be here with us tonight, but we'll catch up with them.
Governor Hunt, do you have anything to add? How are you fighting with the Democratic legislature?
Wait, say again.
Do you have anything to add about your legislative strategy?
Well, my strategy,
He would call people late at night.
That is the rumor.
They would do it right.
my strategy was to run for office on the stuff you wanted to do. In my last campaign for governor, whatever it was, 1986. 96. I ran on a platform of raising teacher pay to the national average. As I told you earlier, we were down in the 40s. The national average was 20. I went around all over this state, up and down, running for governor on a platform of raising teacher pay to the national average. I said, if you want to raise teacher pay to the national average, vote for me. If you don't, vote against me. Vote against vote for that other fellow. Guess what? The people wanted to do it. That's the way politics should work. Let the people decide. But we as candidates have to get out and talk about what the options are and what's involved in it, see? The people knew what they wanted. We won that election. That was a tough, tight election, running against a good man. And then when I gave my inaugural address, gave my State of the State address to the legislature, and then when the legislature started, my bill to raise teacher pay to the national average, I think was House Bill or Senate Bill number 1 to do it. And we figured out how to do it. We figured out exactly how much we'd have to spend, increase our investments. I don't like to call it just spending, but our investments in the public schools in order to get to the national average. What it was going to take was going to be 6% a year for 4 years. And my budgets put that in there. But when I first introduced the bill, when I mentioned it to the legislature, we had 20 CEOs in the legislature supporting that. Head of all the banks, IBM, all the big companies were for it. Those legislators looked around and they said, this is pretty popular. These big business people creating the jobs think we ought to do it. By the way, the bill was supported by the president of the by the President Pro Tem of the Senate, number one man in the Senate, Mark Basnight, and by the Speaker of the House, who was a Republican. And Governor Martin and I had support from his folks in campaigns. Well, when the legislature looked out there and saw, first of all, they saw my election victory. The people spoke. Then they saw all these business people saying, we ought to do it. It'll be good for the economy of North Carolina and for our people. They got behind it, and the legislature was split. Partly Democratic, partly Republican, about half and half. And they voted for it. So that's what you can do in politics. And so for all you young people, we hope you'll get involved. Figure out what you want to do. Talk to candidates and see who's for that. We'll learn what they're for and see if that's interesting to you. We want them to learn about those things. We want them to get involved. This Institute of Politics helps them do that, gives them a chance to do it. If there's ever a place that ought to be encouraging and supporting getting young people involved in politics, it's the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, though I want to see it done everywhere. So we're proud to be a part of this, and that's the way I went about it, and it worked out pretty well.
Another footnote, because some of this, the better schools, better roads, better jobs, was a good campaign issue, and it worked. And the response in the first couple of years after the election was usually pretty good. But even with other issues that come up that was not the focal point of a campaign, the governor has an advantage of being able to talk directly to the people. Many of you out there are journalism students, and you know to be skeptical about what we say from time to time and to probe behind that. You learned that in your journalism class. But you have an opportunity to speak to the people, and you got to use it. You got to use that bully pulpit. Governor Hunt and I were the last two governors to not have the veto. Now, he later had an opportunity of 2 terms with the veto, and I think he'd tell you it's a lot better with the veto, and you don't have to use it. You just have to have it. And you can make use of the fact that it's there. Use it when you have to.
I never used it.
Right.
They knew I had.
And I didn't use it either because I didn't have it. And I made the point that, you know, every governor in America had the veto except North Carolina. It can't be that bad a deal. I mean, I'd say even Georgia, they got. That was my home state, by the way. Y'all never held that against me when I ran for office. I told you, I mean, I admitted that I was from Savannah. I had to be near my mother at the time. Yeah.
When he ran for office, he said he was not from Charlotte, but he was from Mecklenburg County.
Actually, we're
Because at that time, no one from Charlotte could get elected. So.
But, you know, even American Samoa, the governor had the veto. And so I tried to work on that so that my successors would have the advantage of it and got it through the Senate. And again, that's part of working the politics as it comes to you during the course of your service. And all of us have had that experience too.
I promised you would all have a fun evening, and I hope you're having one, yes? So full disclaimer, I'm having so much fun, I just realized that I forgot to bring my watch up here. So somebody tell me what time it is, please. Okay, great. Somebody just get up and start dancing at 8:15, right? I need a cue. I want to talk a little bit about education, if I might. Our economy is changing. The needs that employers have for their employees are changing. Our country is changing. The way we think about our civic duties is changing. I want to start with you, Governor Martin, because you've had experience on a college campus. What do we need to change about what we're doing to prepare our students for citizenship and for employment?
Really, there could easily be several hours worth of discussion here. I'll take just 2 points and try to keep them quick. First of all, this campus has experienced, as many other schools have, problems in maintaining the balance of athletics and academics. I once got a call from former Chancellor Holden Thorpe, who wanted me to look into a problem that the faculty had found, that one of the departments had been offering courses that didn't meet. And he wanted me to look into it independently to see if other departments were involved, to see if other people in that department, Afro-American Studies, were involved, and how widespread it was. And I told him, I knew it would be a mistake to do it, because no matter what I found, I was going to be vilified for it. But I had the presence of mind to say, because he and I were friends, fellow chemists, we'd worked together on some things, and I couldn't tell him no because he was in a bind. I told him, okay, I'll do it if you don't pay me, because I didn't want to be beholden to Thorpe, okay, or anybody. But it was not an easy task. I ended up being not just chairman of the committee, but the whole committee, and had a law firm working to use some software that could help identify if any similar thing were going on in other departments. We fulfilled our task. We found that there was no other department doing anything like it. There were only two people in the department, the chairman and the secretary, who were running this thing. None other members of the department were involved, though sometimes the secretary would sign their names to it. But I didn't get to talk with those two people. Their lawyer wouldn't let them talk to me. I came to the conclusion that there was no evidence that it implicated any member of the coaching staff of any sport on campus. It did turn out that a later investigation found that a member of the faculty who was very close to one of the sports teams had gotten involved encouraging these two. But my conclusion was that it was not so much an athletic scandal as it was an academic scandal. The faculty had not paid attention to this department, this new department, because of its political background, and so nobody was watching. And yet that was to the disadvantage of the many fine members of the faculty of that department who got smeared by the whole thing. Now, I did get vilified because I didn't accuse I did not accuse coaches, because I didn't have any evidence or testimony from anybody that pointed to any of them involved. Were they all innocent? There was no evidence. There's a big difference. Think of that as you go through the latest in a quick series of impeachment processes. You can believe that President Trump did exactly what he's accused of doing, but what do you do if there's no sworn evidence? That's a tough problem. I went through it with the Nixon impeachment process and thought as a juror I should wait until there was not just innuendo and unidentified sources and hearsay, but sworn evidence. We finally got that because the Supreme Court ordered release of those tapes. But that was the background that I came from, that you had to have evidence, and that's what I said. Now, one of my favorite Raleigh daily newspapers didn't like my attitude about that. And so I got raked about quite a bit. But you notice it turns out the NCAA did not find an athletic violation of their rules. Maybe they should have had some rules, but they did. There was no violation of the rules that they had. But it was an academic scandal, and to our great shame. And I'll tell you, one of the things that I found out in looking into that is that there's a bigger scandal that's going on all over the country. in many of our finest universities. It's called grade inflation. When we were in school, and many of you, I see some with some little whisker working here, the average grade was a C. If you had a B, you were at the top of the list for employment. Nowadays, the average grade is B+. And that makes it tough for employers to be able to differentiate. And I say to you students, that's not in your advantage. That deprives you of a way to show the talent that you can provide to an employer. You may not want that, but I think it's valuable. So I think the currency of academic education has been weakened because of the ease of giving A's and B's to everybody. In that department that I talked about, all you had to do was turn in a 20-page paper. If it wasn't 20 pages, you got an incomplete. If it was 20 pages, you got a B+ or an A, depending on what you needed. So that's a big problem, and we need to bear down on that. Here at Chapel Hill and all across the university system, which you and Governor Holzhauser had a hand in leading the consolidation of all of our universities into one unit. There are issues of governance that are very important. It used to be that the Board of Governors would have a majority of the majority party and a minority of the minority party. And now it's important to recognize that my party now has done away with minority party representation. I want them to get back to that. But one of the reasons they did that is because of the general perception of evidence that it's the politics of the left that dominate the faculty, at least the departments that are involved in issues and policy issues of the day. I can't say from personal experience that I can testify about any particular department, but over and over we hear about complaints of people who can't get a job here because their thinking is more conservative. And to the extent that's true, you who are alumni, you who are faculty, you who are administrators, you who are students, need to insist that we not only have diversity of appearance, a diversity of color, a diversity of race, diversity of tribal background for those of us, whatever, but also a necessary diversity of ideas and thought. This is an academic institution, and it must offer its students a chance to hear all sides, even those that may be painful for you. Before our time, we had the speaker ban law in North Carolina to say if somebody was a communist, they couldn't speak. The faculty stood up and got that reversed by our General Assembly. Now, I want to see the faculty stand up and say, we want to get in people who have good academic credentials and can present a different point of view, and we're going to have outside speakers for our students to hear all points of view, not just those that they're comfortable with.
Thank you, Governor Martin. Governor Hunt, I know you want to make a response, and then Governor McCrory, I have a different question for you.
Well,
I got my answer.
I agree with much of what the Governor said, but I want the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and our universities elsewhere to get excellent faculty. I think we should have an array of points of view, but I want us to have excellent faculty, and I want students to have a range of views to think about, and I want professors who will press students, as they did me when I was coming through NC State, about what are you thinking and why, and really press you to the wall to justify your thinking. Now, one thing that I must say here at Chapel Hill tonight is how important it is that we have had students through the years who have believed that racial segregation was wrong and that treating people differently because of their race was wrong and that we ought to do something about it. Students at this university have led that. And I remember when it started. I remember the sit-ins and all that. Over at State where I was, we didn't do much of that. But it was alive and well at Carolina. I remember those students. Some of them got me thinking about it, you know? Heck, I'd never heard about some of that stuff. But then I got to thinking about race. And more in my life, I've realized what our history has been. You all have just read about what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina. I grew up in the South, in the East, on a farm, and we had a lot of people around us who were bigots and a lot who weren't. And our students are the main ones that have thought about it and spoken about it, including a lot of professors, and encouraged us to think about what's right and what our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence have said, and what we ought to do in order to do the right thing and give every person a chance to become all they can and should be. I'm proud of the students who have led that effort, and they've learned a lot of it in their colleges, including here in Davidson and all around, Catawba, all of them. So UNC-Chapel Hill, you're so important. You're so good. Keep working.
Governor McCrory, I'm going to come back to the question I was going to ask you about higher ed. And I want to chase this topic of diversity that Governor Hunt has raised just for a second. Unfortunately, Governor Perdue couldn't be with us this evening, but she's under a whole bunch of pressure because if she doesn't show up, there's not a woman on the stage representing former governors of North Carolina. So as you look into the audience and you see the diversity reflected in terms of gender and ethnicity, what advice do you have for the future governors of North Carolina sitting out there who may not be white men?
Well, I do want to briefly go back to the other subject very quickly. I want to say something to the universities because it is so important to North Carolina's past. It's going to be very important to North Carolina's future, and that is this. I do think as we look 50 years from now or even 10 years from now, that I think the universities throughout the nation are going to have to re-engineer and renew a new objective and a new strategy to adapt to the new economy and even the old economy in several areas. First of all, the cost of a college education is entirely too high. And I'm not just talking about to the students, I'm also talking about to the taxpayers. We've had a 7 to 8% increase every year in the cost of education when the inflation's been at 2%. And we've got to start asking, why is that happening? We've got to start looking for new efficiencies. We've got to ask, for example, I've got a nephew who got accepted to UNC grad school in Kellogg. He went to Kellogg because he'd get his MBA in 1 year as opposed to 2 years. And the new students are smart. They're going to save half the tuition money and also save a year of making money. We're going to have to adapt our universities to the new market conditions. We're still taking summers off, when the only reason we take summers off was for agriculture. It makes no sense that we're running universities in some ways the same way we've been running them for the last 50 to 100 years. And the students, with the loans that they're getting right now, I think they're getting ripped off. And it's unaffordable. It's not fair to these students to have to get $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 in debt at a nonprofit school. Nonprofit. I'm not talking about the for-profit schools. I mean, right now, the average student per year at every one of our universities, if you count the real cost, is at least $60,000 a year. And most people don't know that. If you really count the pension programs, the unfunded liabilities of health care, and no one is talking about it. And we have some universities, sadly, that have a 60 to 70% attrition rate, where students come in their freshman, sophomore year and then leave with student debt and never get their degree. If this were a business, it would be bankrupt. And I'm not discarding the many, many great things our university is doing, but we cannot ignore this problem in this market conditions that we have right now. Because employers that we're recruiting today are looking at the type of students we're graduating, and the students also have to be able to afford to graduate. And we've got to be serious about this issue. We all said every politician in North Carolina, every governor says we have a balanced budget. No, we don't. Every governor in the United States is lying about a balanced budget because we have in North Carolina over $50 billion of unfunded liabilities for health care for state employees and for pension of all state employees, including professors and everyone else. And we're not talking about it. Republicans and Democrats alike, we're all responsible. And I talked to a table of students today and I said, I'm concerned about you getting the debt of our generation and the millennials. What is Generation Z going to do with all this debt? And the universities have to confront this and look for efficiencies, look for sharing of resources, look at technology, and yet keep the strength of what we have. And it's going to really take some re-engineering of what we're going to look like 10 to 20 years now. Very quickly, oh, by the way, I want to say in honor of Bill Friday, who was, I think, just one of the great individuals of this state history. I'm staying in the Moorhead where when I was mayor of Charlotte, he interviewed me for a show, and it was such an honor to meet Bill Friday. It's such wisdom. But going back to athletics very quickly.
Wait. You answered the question I didn't ask you, Governor McCrory.
Yeah.
But good, because I would have asked you.
I just got a quote.
Now you're answering another question, but I also need you to answer the question I did ask you, which is how are we going to diversify our election?
If I may say one word, you done?
Yeah, you can say one word.
Wait. Now I'm totally losing control over the stage.
I know we got to wrap it. Listen.
I allow Jim Hunt to do anything he wants.
There is a lot in what Governor McCrory just said. Higher education ought to be more efficient. Look at the efficiencies in the schools and the community colleges if you want to find out how to do it. But thank God for higher education.
Absolutely.
Thank God for our colleges and universities. You know why America leads the world in innovation and creativity and commercial activity? It's because of our bright people. And most of them get their good ideas and become the great thinkers they are through college. So be grateful to these people who are developing these young minds. I went to undergraduate school at NC State and law school here. I can tell you some of the names of the professors who has developed new ideas and helped students develop those new ideas. And because of great higher education all over the world, I traveled all over the world over all my terms as governor. They wanted their kids to come here. They wanted to learn the technology we're doing here. So we want to support higher education. We want to invest in it strongly. We want to get the best people. We want to get all of our kids to come and participate in it that we can. But we want them to understand, we want all of us to understand how important it is, and that is, it is a key to our economic well-being and future.
Real quick,
your question was about having a governor who's non-white.
How do we have a more diverse political leadership in the state?
Look, it's going to happen. It's going to happen sooner and not later. The demographics of North Carolina show very clearly that the white majority is being overtaken by non-whites. It's just going to happen, but it's going to happen before that. Look, not only with North Carolina voting for Barack Obama for president first time around, but we've had Supreme Court Chief Justice. We've had Speaker of the House of Representatives. We've had all manner of state government officials, but also look at the big city mayors and county commission chairs. And it's just going to happen. You have to get people to work and become better known, and where they're known, they can rise to the top. We can't maybe illustrate that. We just three old white men.
Yeah. I would like to say, if you look at the major metro areas of Charlotte, we have some fantastic leaders, regardless of African-American leaders, people of different sexual orientation,
Sheriffs,
people of different chiefs of police.
School board chairs.
And it's fantastic. And I learned as a governor, you've got to have a diverse board of directors. Because if you only hear from people of the same background, you're not going to make the right decision. It's just a fact.
Thank you. I have one final question for you. Data confirms what most of us feel in our gut, which is that we're in a time of hyper-partisanship and polarization. Are you optimistic that this will change soon, or do you think this is the new normal?
We are so polarized today for several reasons. The parties with gerrymandering has contributed a great deal to that. Social media has, because each one of us has available to us all manner of news sources that only tell us what we want to hear. And we like that. We tend to gather around just those programs that tell us what we want to hear. But what's made it worse is that the center, the people, the moderates, have pulled out of both parties. In North Carolina, the number of people registered and non-affiliated is slightly more than the Republicans and slightly less than the Democrats. I'll close with William Butler Yeats in 1919 wrote a poem. He said, "Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. The worst, I beg your pardon, the best have no conviction, while the worst are full of impassionate intensity." He wrote that about the First World War. Look around us to where we are today. And yet, I don't know what the solution to it is. Maybe if I were a young man coming along and thinking I'd get into politics, I might try to organize a center party to try to at least have somebody that could bring the other two parties back together. The two parties used to overlap. There were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, a lot of them. And so they could work from parties. Yes, there'd be battles, but now they don't have to listen to each other. There's got to be, if you moderates would get back in the party of your choice, that would settle it. You could bring moderation back to your party. But I don't know how to appeal to you to do that, and so I don't know if it's someday we're going to have a center party to represent you.
Governor Hunt?
That's something we need to work on and find a way to change. You can do it differently. We've done it at a different time. Part of what's involved, first of all, is us wanting to do it. Second, to understand that there are benefits from doing it and getting people to work together. We need to change some of the election laws. We need to change some of the campaign financing. We need to look around the country, a state like California, that are doing some things so that the extremists are less likely to win the primaries, so that we moderates don't have anybody less to vote for. Let's work on it that way. It's a real problem, and it's one that we ought to figure out. And we're smart enough to do it. It isn't easy, but the things that these governors are talking about are good things, and all of us ought to work on it, and all these young people in this wonderful program here ought to figure it out. Some of you college professors ought to give it as a term paper and let them write a paper and tell you how to do it. It can be done. It ought to be done.
Governor McCrory, final words.
Well, from a political science standpoint, I want to bring up a concern that I see that's happened at the state legislative level and also at the federal legislative level, and that is we're becoming, in governing in the legislature, is almost like a parliamentary government. We're set up Republicans and Democrats, but within the Republican Party and Democratic caucuses, We have all these other caucuses based upon conservative, liberal, race, gender, you name it. We've got all these other caucuses within the caucus itself, which is becoming like, again, a parliamentary group of government. So the people leading the legislators, whether Republican or Democrat, whether it be Nancy Pelosi or Ryan, either side, they can't bring together a coalition of a majority in order to keep their speakership. And I think that's hurt a great deal in comparison to the days of LBJ. And I see it when I was governor with the Republican legislature. Everyone said, well, you've got a Republican legislature. What's the problem? Well, the Republican legislature had four or five different caucuses within them that were controlling the leadership versus the leadership controlling them. And I think one thing that's really hurting are all these segregated caucuses within each party, Jim. And the Democrats have the same issue. Another thing to follow up on what Governor Martin said, the media right here is more segregated. You know, we talked about diversity. Actually, the media is segregating us. On TV, on the internet, we have our conservative internet, we have our liberal internet, we have racial, gender stations on TV. You know, when we grew up in our generation, we all watched the same thing. We all listened to Motown and the Beatles on the same channel. And that's just not being done anymore. So our media, as they talk about integration, they are actually segregating us by the marketplace to sell advertising. I know this now because I'm in radio. And I see it constantly. So the market conditions in some ways are segregating us, which is impacting also the political structure, especially in the primaries. You know, you see what's going on in Washington. The liberals are more worried about their left in a primary, and the conservatives are more worried about the right getting beat in a primary. They're not really worried about the general election. And that impacts compromise. And I think first we've got to recognize that and identify the problem. And one of the first things I would do is say, let's get rid of all these caucuses within the legislative body. We've got two already, Republican and Democrat. That's tough enough. But we're not a parliamentary form of government, and we've become one, and I think that's divided us.
And support people in politics who recognize this problem. Now, changing it is going to be tough as nails. Those extremists on the right or the left, they don't want to change it. They like to run it. They want it all their way. Some political leaders are going to have to do something about it, and you all support them.
In my life, I like to look for bright spots, the things that cause me, at least, to be optimistic. I started by pointing out the bright spot of the Institute of Politics, a group of students who are leading the way on this campus to bring people together across differences of ideology, to talk to each other, to learn from each other, to maybe even collaborate with each other. How wonderful tonight that this group has converged with another bright spot. 3 wonderful leaders for the state of North Carolina who I hope have demonstrated to you that while they may not agree on everything, they agree on a lot, and they support each other. And if there is one thing that runs across them, it is a passion for the state. Please join me in thanking these 3 gentlemen. And nobody got up and started dancing, which means you were having too much fun to notice it was 8:15. Thank you all.